cerebral asymmetry, greater degree of masculinization. So the more masculine the brain becomes, again, the more kind of patriarchal, lacking in the kind of more feminine traits that we tend to associate with the juvenile phase. It also ages us. Hormones basically force us to mature. The basic model is we need to mature and sexually reproduce. That's really what the hormones are doing. They're trying to get your basic mammalian model to maturity. The quicker it gets to maturity, the quicker it breeds, the more successful it is. Again, greater specialization, earlier sexual maturity. So the obvious: reduced steroid activity, less cerebral asymmetry, less degrees of masculinization, and so on. I am repeating this a bit, and I know it's kind of basic biology, but it's worth trying to hang on to some of this or look at it again when it's online. Steroids play a massive role. That's the message I'm trying to get across. They regulate every aspect of our development, every aspect of our function, and they play a massive role in our brain development and function. So when you look at these things in context, basically looking at human evolution, there's some very odd facts start coming out of it. And they don't get an awful lot of press as yet, even though they're acknowledged to exist. Humans are generally regarded as having highly neotenized traits. We tend to show a lot of juvenile traits, and we hang on to them into adulthood. There's been a lot written about it. There was a lot written about it in the 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of people convinced that it was our unique brain was something to do with our juvenile traits, but nobody could make the connection. What is the mechanism? What's driving it? So a lot of books written on this, a lot of papers. You can still access them. The other thing that's really unusual, I've already touched on it. Humans formed an extremely rare symbiotic relationship with the juvenilizing female reproductive organs of the angiosperm. So again, I'm talking about fruit. So we've got these two really unusual things going on in human evolution, and they've both been written on quite a lot, but never put together. So when you start thinking about this, we've got the relics of a very juvenile form, and we've got evidence that we formed a relationship with the sex organs of plants, which happen to be very juvenilizing. So I think there's a really big clue there. There's a little bit more detail. So again, when you think about the activity of our steroids and the impact it has on our development, or the way our brains develop, the way our reproductive systems develop, and then you discover that female reproductive organs of the angiosperms are rich in steroid inhibiting and hormonally active compounds. Basically, the very mechanisms that drive and read our DNA were being infused and diluted by these compounds from the plants, and in doing so, changing the way our DNA was read. So when we're immersed in this stuff, which when you're in a symbiotic relationship, if you're eating several kilos a day of these sex organs, it makes up minimum 60-70% of your diet, maybe even more. There's some evidence that humans were even more specialized in eating this stuff. It's going to have a massive impact on every aspect of your development, and particularly your brain. And what I'm suggesting is that it was this relationship that really shaped us, shaped our physiology and shaped our brain, gave us a very, very different kind of brain. So again, we have these clues. Most complex thing we know, lots and lots of investigation into why we have such a big brain, why we're so intelligent, allegedly. Some absolutely crazy theories. It all happened on the savannah. Well, there's nothing to build and run a brain on the savannah. It's because we lived on the coast because we needed omega-3 oils to build our brain, or it's because we ate meat. Well, meat eating's been around a long time. It doesn't result in brains like this. And oddly enough, if you take humans out of the equation, and some of our extinct relatives that have had a lot of research, the hominids, if you were visiting here on a kind of safari type visit from another dimension or whatever, the great apes already have a phenomenally large brain for their body size. There's already a mechanism at work in the forest that builds big brains. Big brains for that kind of body size are incredibly rare, don't exist anywhere in the fossil record. The only examples really are the primates, the great apes, and then the whales and dolphins. Totally different route, but they've ended up with something similar. So we have all this evidence that something cool going on in the forest, and yet all the research has been done in these very hostile environments, because it was presumed that you need a hostile environment to drive the need to survive, to come up with complex solutions to difficult problems, and that would somehow grow your brain. Yet weirdly enough, our brain, although it tripled in size in 2 billion years, and there's been a lot of focus on that, our brain actually stopped expanding roughly 200,000 years ago, and it's been shrinking. We've lost roughly a tennis ball's worth of neural tissue. But there's another theory to explain that. Domestication theory. We've somehow domesticated ourselves. That's why we've lost the neural tissue. Are we nearly at break time? Okay, we'll take a break now, and then I hope after the break it'll start all coming together. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, I know I've talked about a lot of disparate things, and possibly sounds a little bit disjointed, but hopefully it's going to start joining together now and make at least a little bit of sense. So, seen one of these diagrams already. I'm going to go through 3 or 4 of these and just try and highlight how all these pieces start coming together. Then I'm going to look a little bit at some of the evidence that exists to support this, and then if this time I'll take some questions at the end. So, as I was talking about before, this is a very simplified idea of outline of the basic mechanism of how this works. Say we have our library, our blueprint, our DNA code, and say read primarily by hormones, sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. That results in structure, including our brain. Brain runs the endocrine system, the hormone system. And say it's a fairly closed loop, but it also affects the next generation in the maternal line. And what enters this loop through diet generally doesn't have a huge impact, not on the hormonal mechanism. And for the vast majority of species, this is the case. However, when you add this to the equation, remember, although we know it is fruit today, you've got to start thinking about this as the female reproductive organs of the flowering plants. This starts entering the equation, changes the way our own hormones work, so it changes the way the DNA code is read, changes how the brain is built, that in turn changes how the brain runs the hormone system. Radical and very potential for rapid change, because really you're changing the way the whole DNA code is read by adding this to the equation. And then in the female line, these changes affect how the next generation brain develops. So there's an inheritance mechanism built into this, which so far hasn't been picked up that much. There's a little bit of interest now. You've probably heard the term epigenetics, transgenerational epigenetics, how things can affect several generations. But I think this is exactly what was going on in the forest for millions of years. And one of the biggest anomalies, or one of the biggest mysteries in studies of human evolution, is the colossal size of our brain, particularly our neocortex. It's quite clear that the vast majority of species have survived and adapted very successfully with tiny brains. You don't need a big brain to survive. It's not really about survival. And Western science has tried to figure out what on earth we needed this for. And again, the presumption has been hostile environments, trying to solve problems. We needed a big brain, and through adaptive selection, the classic Darwinian mechanism, that's how we ended up with this very large brain. However, some people have pondered this for a long time and wondered if our large brain was an incidental product of some other mechanism. Never quite got to what the mechanism is, but when you look at the existing data, this to me looks like a very viable mechanism, that you end up basic mammalian species in symbiotic relationship with the reproductive organs, and you end up creating a very juvenilizing environment. I've touched on this already. Juvenilizing environments create juvenile organisms. And in humans and in other species, in the juvenile phase, when our brain is still relatively undifferentiated, the cellular sort of profile is very uniform, very similar cellular structure. We have phenomenal capacity to learn. Most species in the juvenile phase, that's when they learn their life skills. Then they sexually mature, the brain differentiates, and a lot of species tend to run on what they've learned. There's not that much capacity for new learning, or it diminishes as species age. The classic old dog's new tricks. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. Well, I think with humans and some of our extinct relatives, we got locked into this relationship, and it kept us from maturing in the normal way. We normally think maturing is a good thing, and of course in many ways it is. But I think what actually happened to our ancestors is we became progressively juvenilized. We didn't mature in the normal way. It's not that we stopped growing, we still grew, but our brain stayed in that expansive phase. It kept growing, and the tissue stayed juvenile, very plastic, very responsive, and it gave us phenomenal capacity to learn, not just when we were juvenile, sort of 5 to 15 or whatever, but right through our lifetime. And it also brought a lot of other traits we associate with being juvenile, so that kind of inherent empathy and compassion, that lack of aggression, the lack of hierarchy, the lack of competition. Again, really symbiotic organism. We behaved in a very symbiotic way. And there's I've not yet come across a mechanism that can explain this in any meaningful way. The efforts so far the theories that exist are so full of holes. Why on earth we'd have a tripling in size, and the brain's incredibly expensive to build. It's very expensive to run. I think our brain uses roughly 20% of our energy, even though it only weighs a couple of kilos. So really, neural tissue is highly expensive, and unless there's an obvious use for it, you don't have a big brain. But if you end up with a big brain as an incidental byproduct of this relationship, it all starts to make sense. In fact, you could go as far as saying that really, mammalian DNA can't really build one of these very easily. Doesn't have the complexity, doesn't produce the chemistry. And really, it's the forest and the sex organs that built our brain for us. Our brain's almost like a hybrid brain. The plants engineered it, the plants built it. Of course, when this has been part of the equation for millions of years, and then suddenly it disappears, things are going to change. You're going to lose the steroid inhibition, and you end up being exposed to your own basic mammalian hormone system. And how can this happen? Well, tropical forests, at least as far as we know, can be very stable. They can last for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, particularly along the equator. They can shrink and expand depending on climate cycles, but they can be very stable. They even generate their own weather. It's kind of stuff that's been written about for a long time. And if you're if you're developing and expanding neural system with all these new skills and abilities depends on the forest, is integral to the forest, then in some ways this becomes the Achilles heel. And during extreme climate events, extreme climate epochs where it gets very dry, the forests can shrink to the point of almost disappearing, particularly the African forests. The African tropical forests, although they are genuine tropical forests, are not as wet as the Asian and South American forests. There's not as much rainfall, so they're more susceptible to climatic drying, global sort of climatic events. And the pollen record supports this, that the African forests on occasion can fragment and almost disappear. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen in cyclical events, sort of 50, 100, 200,000 years apart, even longer. And this is obviously a big problem. If the forest disappears, you lose this, but you already have a big intelligent brain. So it's not necessarily that you're not going to survive. And you end up with environments more like this, biochemically relatively impoverished. There's not much chemistry here compared to this. Chemistry off the scale, chemistry very little. And primates typically, in difficult times, they eat what are called fallback foods. Roots, tubers, chemically reasonably rich, but nothing like this, and without the hormonally active elements. And then in addition, depending on how hostile the environments are, we can eat meat. Trouble is with eating meat, it's kind of recycling mammalian hormones. So you're kind of recycling this basic mammalian hormonal environment, which is the very thing that was being inhibited by the fruit. You start adding this in, you lose the inhibition, and basically the DNA is being read differently, and it's basically trying to build a much earlier kind of brain. More specialized, more genetic asymmetry, and maturing more quickly and more masculine, and bringing with it all those traits that are actually causing us a lot of problems today. The kind of aggression, the fear, the need for control, a general loss of cognitive function. So we're becoming more stupid. We like to think we're more clever, but are we really when you look at what we're doing? And again, depending on the hostile environments, so we come out of the forest with something intelligent, and if we need to, we find solutions to problems. So we come across things that are toxic, they're poisonous, we can't ingest them in their natural form. Remember, a lot of plants are highly defended chemically, and animals generally don't want to be eaten, they run away, they're quite hard to catch. But we find ways to catch things and to transform them, and we use heat to denature the molecular chemicals that would cause us problems. Of course, in doing this, so you're changing the chemical formula of what you're eating. Let's say it's a toxic root of some sort, and the only way you can eat it is heat process it, but in doing so you're processing the rest of the chemistry in there. You're changing the chemical composition. It's going from biochemistry to chemistry. So we've already had really big change here, and then an even bigger change here. We're moving from biochemistry to chemistry. So it's changing the hormonal environment. It's also changing, remember earlier I talked about very basic engineering parameters. So we're changing the design, we're also changing the construction materials radically. This has never really been part of biological evolution until very, very recently. And same with the fuel. This stuff, talking a lot about the hormonal effects, I think that's the key bit, but just happens to be rich and simple sugars, which is exactly what our brain runs on. It's a really good package. You get your hormonal stuff, you get a lot of antioxidants. Brain is very, very susceptible to oxidization. It kind of rusts and it needs an awful lot of protection. Well, it doesn't matter so much when you're flooding your system with this. In fact, a symptom of symbiotic organisms is you can lose some of your own capacity when the other part of the organism or equation is producing so much of it. So primates are known, very unique, not to produce their own vitamin C. We don't produce our own vitamin C, which is odd because we have this colossal thing that needs a lot of antioxidants to protect it. So the idea that this evolved in an environment that was low in vitamin C, this kind of environment, is a joke. But if you're flooded with this kind of stuff, it's rich in not just vitamin C, the classic antioxidant most of us know about, but a whole range of other antioxidants, including a class of compounds called flavonoids. They give fruit the colour. Well, these are the compounds, there's hundreds if not thousands of them. They're very powerful antioxidants. They're hormonally active. They're the compounds that inhibit hormones. They're also neuroactive. They actually stimulate the brain to work harder. They kind of give you a lift. And I touched on the pineal earlier in the talk. Well, actually, compounds in fruit stimulate the pineal to work harder. The monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you might have heard about them in sort of drug culture and so on, or they're prescribed by the pharmaceutical companies. Used to be thought the pineal was kind of isolated, it was bulletproof, you couldn't get it to work differently, it just was isolated. But it's turned out that if you add monoamine oxidase inhibitors, makes the pineal work harder and produce the chemicals I mentioned, pinealine and melatonin, which also happen to inhibit sex steroids. So you're getting a double whammy. The fruit's pouring in, inhibiting the sex steroids, making the pineal work harder, inhibiting the steroids, allows you a long window of juvenility to grow a big brain, and it's a different kind of brain. It's a more juvenile brain. So we move on to this. Radically different inputs, different design, different construction, different fuel. Totally novel this, say not being part of biological evolution. Chemistry, it's inert, it's dead, it's missing lots and lots of biological activity. And finally, in more recent times, we're building the most complex thing we know that's responsible for all our decisions and everything we do, from what we laughingly call junk. And this has got no relationship whatsoever to biology. This is completely contrived. We call it food, but it's not food. It's some kind of industrial process stuff. It's been heat denatured, and most of the species we use are not primate foods. It's mostly grass seeds and some tubers. Tubers, yes, primates will eat them raw as fallback foods, but we also use a huge amount of grass seeds, and grass seeds don't like to be eaten. I'm talking about rice, barley, wheat, corn. They're all grass seeds, not primate foods. In fact, we have to process them to eat them. That's how not primate food they are. If you can't eat it in its natural state, it's not a food. We have to soak the stuff, beat it, boil it, microwave it, beat it again, and then we think we can eat it, and we build our brain from it. It's quite worrying. Some of these text slides I'm probably going to skip over, although they're on other YouTube videos, because a lot of these slides I could talk about for quite a while, but there's just not enough time to go into all the detail. I suppose this is like a visual analogy of what I think's gone on with the brain. Anyway, the evidence is quite good that sex steroids regulate cerebral dominance. And remember, I'm suggesting our dominant hemisphere is actually in really poor shape. It's quite dysfunctional now. And how do we have this lateralized function? Well, the thinking was for a long time that it was specialized adaptation. We developed a left hemisphere that had conceptual thoughts, and it was somehow highly advanced. By definition, of course, the left hemisphere is in charge, and it's giving itself a clean bill of health because all the scientists have a left hemisphere. So the theories they come up with are by definition left hemisphere theories. It's basically, the idea is if there's a gremlin in our neural system, how can we look at things without looking through the filter of a dysfunctional left hemisphere? Very difficult, but you can look at the data. If you look at the objective data, it starts to make sense. You've just got to be wary of the conclusions. But what has come out of the research, testosterone in particular plays a major role in lateralization. More testosterone activity, more asymmetry, less, and so on. And you can imagine, it's a bit weird, it's a sort of a King Solomon idea, but if you were to split a male and a female and join them that way, and add or subtract either estrogens or androgens like testosterone, these things are so powerful that you can have basically a female, a genetic female, And in a high androgen environment, the genetic female will develop as a male, including a male type brain, and vice versa. So I'm just emphasizing, if you want to know how some of the most powerful things in our development and in our evolution, yeah, DNA code, the library, very important, but how it's read is probably a lot more important. In fact, as an adult male, if I take enough estrogen, I'll start developing breasts. Not because my DNA is any different, but because my DNA is being read very differently. That's how powerful hormones are. So as I say, a lot of theories, and yet we've got sat in front of us. We know the tropical forests are very complex biochemically. We know we lived in the tropical forest for a huge amount of time. We know we were ingesting the reproductive organs, the angiosperms, which are incredibly rich in biochemistry. And yet there's been this obsession. It all happened on the savannah, it happened on the coast, and there's not a coherent theory to explain it. Really simple, actually. I've probably managed to make this more complicated than it needed to be, but a very simple idea. And the reason I think it's important is, in order to make sense of where we are now, we need to understand the mechanisms that got us here. And there is more interest in this, slowly developing. It was always about the code, single changes in the code, change in structure, change in function. Is it beneficial? Will it be inherited? But epigenetics, and particularly what I'm talking about, it's reading the whole code differently. That's a massive change. Instead of talking about individual code changes, which has been the sort of the main focus of kind of Darwinian theory, although Darwin himself wrote a lot about symbiosis, it's not had the attention it deserves. But when you're talking about changing the hormone regime, you change the way the code is read completely. You end up with something totally different. And of course, if what I'm talking about has any validity, there'd have to be mechanisms. And I'm saying there are mechanisms. They're actually very well researched. They exist. They've just not been put together. A lot of research, for example, on the compounds I mentioned earlier, flavonoids. 20 years ago, very little data. Now, pretty much every week there's stuff published on these compounds. They, amongst other things, they act as pigments in plants, and particularly in fruit. If you think about fruit, again, these reproductive organs, it's a symbiotic relationship, and the plants themselves, the different species of plants, are competing for trade. They want the fruit to be eaten, so the seeds are taken away and disseminated. Classic symbiotic relationship. And you end up with this idea of competition. The fruits that can provide the biggest treat, that become the most appealing, whether it's color, whether it's taste, whether it makes you feel good, they're going to do well. And it's potential fast-track evolution. It's not coming from the mammalian DNA, it's coming from competition within the plants to produce the goods that make us feel good. And if those chemicals also happen to start building as a new and really cool brain, well, that's just a fortunate accident. And I think that's what happened. These chemicals, they do all of the things I've said. The research is very good now. They act to inhibit steroids. They're neuroactive, so they stimulate brain function. They're powerful antioxidants, so they protect the brain. It's like the perfect package to build and run a really big, complex brain. Right, going back to left-right brain material, where I think this ties together. This is basically the conclusion that came out of all that research, and I'll just read through it quickly just to emphasize it. It's very consistent. Our left hemisphere is hormonally retarded. I mean, that alone should have us worried. And this data is, it's not my data. It's come out of all this cutting-edge neurological research. Our left hemisphere cannot accurately perceive reality. Remember, it's dominant. It's hormonally retarded. It can't perceive reality. Our left hemisphere is seriously deluded, and our left hemisphere continually lies without realizing. The kind of academic term is confabulates. So our left hemisphere is in a constant state of lying. It narrates life, it lies all the time, and it doesn't even know it's doing it. We see it in everybody else. We see all the little games we play in each other, but don't think people can't see the games you play. It's the same. And again, scientific data on this. Our left hemisphere is perceptually dominant. It contributes the overriding influence in our experience of who we think we are. The singular terminology, I or me, is your left hemisphere referring to itself. So I'm basically saying our left hemisphere dominance is a product of this symbiotic breakdown. We lose the symbiosis with the forest, and our basic mammalian DNA is now trying to build a basic mammalian brain. And because there's genetic asymmetry between the hemispheres, the change is happening asymmetrically. Our left hemisphere is reverting to a more typical mammalian brain type more quickly than our right hemisphere. Yeah, and again, when you look at the data on this, it's fascinating. Lots and lots of academic papers written on this, books written about it. On the one hand, we're told we're highly advanced, we have all this conceptual ability, and at the same time, the data that emerges is our left hemisphere. Some of its basic traits include self-deception, delusion, anosognosia, which is a clever term for saying we have some kind of dysfunction that we're not aware of. It's an inability to be aware of your own dysfunction. It's saying confabulation, lies. This is in the literature. There's a lot of this in the literature. Now you'd think that would have made headlines. It's like, okay, we stop what we're doing and figure out what's going on. But that's not what happened. That's not what happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. It's written about, and then you get the people who've done this research come up with fantastic data. They end up writing conclusions that do not match the data. So all this is going on, and then you get people, I mean, there's PhD papers written on why it is we evolved this phenomenal ability for self-deception. Never a question about is there a problem, just, well, there must be a reason for it. We must have evolved this way. We must have adapted to have these functions and skills. So Michael Gazzaniga, he was one of the early researchers in left-right brain work. He's still active. He's getting on a bit now. I think he's done some phenomenal work, but like all the other researchers I've been in touch with, he's forgotten he's studying his own left hemisphere. So great data, but he never applies it to himself. None of these researchers do. So basically, as I said before, his left hemisphere, the data he's come up with, he's basically saying his left hemisphere is deluded and confabulates. His left hemisphere is perceptually dominant. So he's basically, him and his colleagues have come up with lots of evidence that our left hemisphere is in an absolute mess. And yet, despite that, you'll see this in one of the clips online, he's basically bigging up the left hemisphere. Don't leave home without your left hemisphere. And you see this inability to match the data with the kind of the way they write up the summaries. There's a big gap there. And these are some of the cutting edge people in their fields. Bruce Miller, I'm just going to touch on this quickly. Again, interesting from academics. He was researching Alzheimer's brain degeneration. Interestingly, the left hemisphere degenerates more quickly than the right. Classic examples would be we lose speech but we can sing when we get old, or we lose our short-term memory but we have phenomenal eidetic memory. We can remember childhood stuff when these kind of aging processes really kick in. But he also noticed that as the left hemisphere fails, it can release some of the function I was hinting at earlier, some of these high functions that most of us don't get access to. And he even called it the bully part of the brain, which I think for an academic is quite emotive language. Daryl Trefford, he spent about 40 years studying Savant syndrome. I'm sure you've probably heard or seen the classic Rain Man film. Well, there's a lot of research on savants. And again, the idea with savants used to be, oh, well, if you have damage in the left hemisphere, there's compensatory function in the right hemisphere. Of course, compensation should be like for like, or at least similar. But the kind of function that people can access in the right hemisphere is not only better, it's often 10 or 100 or 1,000 times better, and different pathways to get there, far more efficient. So the evidence suggests we have a radically different way of perceiving the world and doing things that's way, way better, but we normally don't get access to it. But he has come to the conclusion after 40 odd years that really it's about release from the tyranny of the left hemisphere. And again, pretty harsh words from an academic. And again, Trefford, despite saying all this, and I've been in touch with him a few times, a bit like Gazzaniga, he's forgotten he's got a left hemisphere. So he's done all this amazing study, and then in one of the communications I had, he's basically defending the left hemisphere. We're a left brain society, the left brain is served as well. So you get these kind of juxtapositions that don't make any sense from people who are writing the papers that filter down through the universities and into the popular press. Well, they're basically studying their own brain, and they've found these major problems, but the problems are so weird that they tend to blind you to the obvious conclusions. Alan Snyder, based in Australia, he got interested in all of this, and he started using some pretty cool kit, non-invasive kit. He still, I think, thinks the idea that the left hemisphere is somehow specially adapted. He still believes that, but he was interested, well, can we switch the left hemisphere off and get some of these more primal skills going? So he's using a magnetic field to dampen down the left hemisphere. Everybody thought he was nuts back in about 2000, but his experiments have gone well. And by inhibiting the left hemisphere, you can start getting hints of these savant-like skills coming through simply by switching part of it off. And oddly enough, some of his subjects during those experiments start reporting feelings of euphoria and bliss. Now again, it's one thing trying to sell the idea of adaptive kind of traits, conceptual traits, maybe that's a good idea, but why would we trade feeling really good for feeling relatively crap? I mean, what are our reference points anyway? You know, what is a really good day? And how good can the human brain feel when it's really on fire, when it's really working? Persinger, he took another route, tried to stimulate the right hemisphere using this contraption. I think they ended up calling it the God helmet or something because of the results they had. He did acknowledge in correspondence that he'd never even considered the biochemistry, even though it's in the literature, even though if he'd spoken to the anthropologist, the primatologist, the pharmacologist, we'd know all this stuff's gone missing, but we're not really looking at it. Many of these people, it's just take the brain as if it fell out of the sky, figure out how it works. No account of the context. In fact, one of the left brain's traits is it does not do context. So the left brain's decided, oh, well, it's really good at kind of looking at detail. It doesn't do context, but that's the left brain's own assessment of itself. Right hemisphere, oddly enough, does phenomenal context and phenomenal detail. The left hemisphere can do a bit of detail, and that's it. Ian McGilchrist, he published a book a few years ago, was in touch with him before he published it. He'd been studying this for about 20 years. Fascinating book, at least the first half is, all the neurology. Similar conclusions. And basically, this is a quote, I've used quite a bit of his. An increasingly mechanistic, fragmented, decontextualized world marked by unwarranted optimism mixed with paranoia and a feeling of emptiness has come about, reflecting, I believe, the unopposed action of a dysfunctional left hemisphere. So pretty harsh stuff. Again, he's immersed himself in this for 20 years. And yet, weirdly enough, concerned as I am about the apparent neglect suffered by the right hemisphere and its version of the world, I do not myself take the view that the workings of the left hemisphere are intrinsically pathological. So which is it? Classic left brain. Basically, data saying one thing, conclusion totally the opposite. So he's forgot he's got a left brain, even though he's spent 20 years looking at this stuff. And I talked about the ancient traditions before. One of the common themes in these traditions, you'll hear it a lot, is the word delusion, that we've slid into some kind of delusion. It's in virtually all the major traditions. We've now become deluded. We all understand the term delusion, but how do we know if we're actually deluded? Well, it's difficult unless you're willing to self-assess and be really honest. But if you look at the literature, the relatively objective literature, it's basically telling us that our dominant hemisphere, the one we use the most, is deluded. it's in denial, it lies. That should really worry us. We should be saying, hang on a minute, let's stop and figure this out. Of course, what the left hemisphere does is deny all that and just get on as if everything's okay, including some of the best researchers around. 2 more minutes and then I'll wrap it up. Skip that one. I'm going to get on to, you may have heard of her, don't know, she had a stroke in the left hemisphere, had a fairly average but interesting altered experience. I had quite a bit of correspondence with her. Basically, once she recovered and got normal function back, she's done tours and talking about how positive thinking can help and so on. But for her to experience what she experienced, she had to have kind of blood vessel explode in her left hemisphere. It nearly killed her and shut her left hemisphere down for a while. That's how she had her experience. And yet she now sort of talks about, well, it's enough to think positively. So again, there's a mismatch between what happened and how she explains herself now. Yeah, we got Sacha Baron Cohen. Why is he on there? Well, I think he's a great student of human psychology. I'm sure if you've seen any of his stuff, he can walk into a room, say a few sounds, a few words, and terrify the hell out of people because he doesn't follow the rules that we all agree to follow. And it's quite amusing to watch how frightened people get when he turns up because he's going to say something that's not quite within our comfort zone. So fascinating. Tenuous link. His cousin, Simon Baron Cohen, is one of the world authorities on hormones in early development, how hormones affect our brain, particularly how testosterone affects the male brain. And out of his research has come a lot of data on how fetal testosterone predicts how far along the autistic spectrum we are. More testosterone, further along the spectrum. Now, if he'd bothered going along the corridor to pharmacology, anthropology, whatever, he would have realized that in our past, testosterone would have been greatly diluted and inhibited, so we wouldn't be as far along the autistic spectrum as we are now. I'm talking males primarily, but also females to some degree. Just never occurred to him. Skip that one. Probably going to finish on these, I think. It's Catherine Milton. She's an anthropologist with a great interest in the brain. She actually studies primates in the wild. She's actually done some analysis of their diet. So going back to those early slides where I was talking about engineering parameters, design, build quality, fuel, etc. Well, looking at her research and crunching the numbers a little bit, I mean, I got in touch with her and I was quite excited because I've approached people who are experts in several disciplines, so they've got more context. And initially, when I asked her, you know, she studied this for a long time, asked her about the effect of fruit on neural development, her response was, isn't fruit mostly sugar and water? Even though fruit's full of these flavonoid compounds, you know, it's in the literature. So again, somebody in the field, considered an expert, never considered this at all. Anyway, looking at her data, we've lost at least 95% of these specifications that originally built our brain. We've lost 95% of the design, the transcription modifying chemicals, the flavonoids that inhibit the steroids. We've lost 95% of these unique construction materials we built ourselves in our brain from a high fruit diet. We've lost 95% of the protection. Our brain needs a lot of antioxidants to stop it degenerating. So if you're flooding yourself with this stuff, it doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter if you can't make vitamin C anymore, like I said before. Well, we've lost 95% compared to our ancestral diet. Same with the fuel, simple sugars, 95% loss. And these are conservative figures. It's actually closer to 98%, but you know what it's like if somebody picks you up and you're 1% wrong, the whole theory's wrong. So I use 95%. It's a conservative figure. It's more like 98%. And that's in people who eat quite healthily. That's what we've lost in terms of the design of the most complex thing we know. Maybe I'll finish on this. So, again, there's lots of areas to look at. There was an interesting experiment in the 1960s So when people talk about, oh, actually left-right brain stuff's too simple, I read it in a book somewhere or whatever, before LSD was criminalized, and looking at the range of human experience, we have an incredibly narrow experience now. We're allowed to go to school, go to college, get a job, watch some telly, maybe go on holiday. That's about the depth of our experience. But of course, these traditions suggest we have capacity for vastly more experience. And one way to get a taste of those experiences is to use certain classes of drugs that only stimulate the right hemisphere. LSD happens to be one of those. And in the mid-60s, there was a guy, God knows what he was thinking about, fascinating that he did it. He had a bunch of people who had lesions, epileptic lesions on one hemisphere or the other, and he was going to do a lobectomy or a hemispherectomy, take away a big piece of the brain. It was a crude treatment in the 1960s. And he got it into his head, he thought, oh, it'd be interesting to give them all a trip first, an acid trip first, then do the surgery, then they can take another acid trip when they're recovered. I don't know what he was on, I've got an idea, but he did this, and the paper is published. You can find the paper. And what he found, and why it's not cited more now, I'm not sure, is that the typical responses to LSD, and depends what you've read or you've experienced, there's a lot of negative propaganda. People can get into trouble with some of these chemicals, but if they're used carefully and in the right setting, they can have phenomenally expansive impact on your perception. They're increasingly used in microdosing to enhance cognitive performance. Extreme athletes use them to enhance their reflexes, downhill skiers, this kind of stuff. Basically enhances your function. I don't think it's the chemical itself, it's because it's differentially works in the right hemisphere, and this is what he found. So you take the left hemisphere out of the equation, it doesn't make any difference. If you take the right hemisphere out, so the people who had to have their right hemisphere taken out, and the people took a trip again, they didn't experience the normal kind of LSD reaction. So basically LSD only works in the right hemisphere. Why? Because the left hemisphere has changed so much. It's now a much more primitive machine. It doesn't have the capacity. The right hemisphere, if you light it up with some of these chemicals, it starts working. It can be confusing initially, and it's not a magic wand, but it's another clue. And this is a paper in the literature. They say this was published in the 1960s. We are kind of out of time, but I'll just whiz through these quickly. This is just a basic botany lesson in case anybody who's not familiar with it. This is your sex organ of your flower, of your flowering plant. You see there's some parallels, ovary, what we got, placenta. Some of the terminology is the same. These are the structures that the plants build when they're building a sex organ, pretty varied, not like leaves and twigs, highly, highly sort of variable. And essentially, I think this is what happened. This is where the plant grows its next generation. It's a juvenile-inducing environment. It manages the very juvenile form of the plants. Well, when you form a relationship with it, metaphorically, I think this is what happened. We were immersed in this stuff from birth till death for millions of years, and it changed every aspect of our development, made us more juvenile, built us a big brain with different functions. Basically, we stayed there for millions of years. And it's not a huge leap to say, quite literally, we were the children of the forest, not metaphorically. I think we were born of the forest. Our brain was developed at least our new brain was developed by the forest. And our separation from the forest through climatic events has meant our brains slowly been reverting to a much more primitive type. And I think that's the core of our problem. So I know it's been a mad whistle-stop tour. Really, all I can suggest is if you're interested, follow this up, do your own research. I've got more extensive talks online where it's not been so rushed. I've had more time to fill in the gaps. All I've tried to do is suggest that some of these areas are worth looking at, and they do join together eventually. They do start making a coherent picture. As Rob said, I have got a book which covers a lot of the basics. I think particularly in conjunction with some of the longer talks I've done that are online, they fill in a lot of the gaps. So apologies for the rushed whiz around with it all. I hope it stimulated some interest. Got time for a couple of quick questions. Fire away.
Yeah.
Yep.
Have you changed your personal diet as a result of your research?
That's what I was going to ask.
It's kind of the other way on. I didn't set out with this in mind. I didn't have this kind of mission. Well, actually, it was actually when I was at Edinburgh Botanic Gardens. There was a friend of mine got me. I had quite a straight upbringing. I wasn't interested in anything like this, but for whatever reason, I got my hands on some literature which asked a lot of questions about modern diet and how insane it was what we were building our brain from. So I got interested in a dietary change. That was all, and I changed my diet from a pretty typical Western diet, not very healthy. Started eating a more natural diet with a lot of fruit. That's all I was interested in. But after about 2 or 3 years, I started noticing perceptual changes, not massive, but enough. And that's kind of what got me interested. And I started doing more research and then doing more experimentation, and it kind of snowballed into a project.
No,
And
the last few years I started eating a hell of a lot more fruit,
mm-hmm.
and I feel a hell of a lot better.
Yeah.
More aware.
Yeah. Well, I see it as having done all this research, I think basically our left hemisphere is in real poor shape now. It doesn't care what it runs on. That's why you can feed it on rubbish and it kind of doesn't change its function that much. But if you change your diet and put a lot of this complex biochemistry back, you're potentiating the right hemisphere. It needs that to work on. It still has a high specification, but that's only part of the kind of equation. So you potentiate it. Then you have to engage in techniques that these ancient traditions